you so much. Great, thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out this morning. Thanks to Professor Knowlton for the gracious introduction. Thanks to Professor Rafter for his introduction. It's just delightful to be here. One of the things I take joy in now that my own children are grown and gone is seeing virtual children in the world of journalism and communications and trying to encourage you all to do your best for your country, for the business, for the world, and all the rest. I learned something about your country in the last 10 minutes. I'll see who knows this and who doesn't. So who knows the place name Donnybrook in Dublin? Everybody knows that. I was surprised to know that not everybody in Ireland knows the US English connotation of that noun. Who knows this as a noun in American English? This is actually fast. So, Professor, would you like to explain what Donnybrook means in American English? If you
as a person who grew up over there, it was a common bit of parliament, a common lowercase word, and it meant a row, a mess, a disaster, a brawl, brouhaha, a conflagration, a kerfuffle. Pick your ethnicity. It's one of those.
So it is amazing. So I lived for a long time in Shanghai, in China.
Oh, that's a word too.
Yes, exactly. And in common English parlance, you can say somebody was shanghaied into a venture from the old days of maritime involuntary servitude. Nobody in the actual Shanghai has any idea that their city name has that connotation in English. Also, so go forth and know that if you encounter any American on the streets of Dublin, you see them staring at the sign that says, this is Donnybrook or whatever, and they're looking sort of poleaxed. It's because they didn't know there was an actual place with that name. And so you now know that if you go to the US on your next trip to the US, you could say, well, that was a real Donnybrook, and then people will think you're a local. So that's my bit of local knowledge I'll impart to you. So let me tell you what my hope for the time we have together. There are a number of topics that I'm happy to entertain your questions, complaints, or thoughts on, but won't be part of my initial presentation. And to prepare you for those, just in case you want to ask about those, I can talk to you about the history of The Atlantic, my magazine, which was founded actually in 1857. Here is a pop quiz. Who was our first presidential endorsement? The answer would be Abraham Lincoln in 1860. We waited more than a century before doing another. We can talk about the history of The Atlantic. I'm happy to talk to you about the business transformation of The Atlantic, which is the oldest magazine in the US, is now seen as one of the most successful commercially. And it's a combination of our print business, of our online business, which has about 40 million viewers worldwide, our events business, and all the rest, and what that shows about the business future for journalism during your time. I'll be happy to talk to you, if you want, about the specific role of US-based social media companies as they have their effect in the outside world, and the differential ethics, as I see them, of Facebook versus Twitter versus Google versus some of the others. I think there are important distinctions to bear in mind, but I'll let you ask me about that later on. I'll be happy to talk either about what's happened in China in the last couple of days, if anybody is a China hand. I lived there for a long time and have followed what's going on, and also about US policy towards Ireland, towards the UK, towards EU. That's all on the array of things. If you ask me, I will tell you, but I will not tell you unless you ask me. What I am going to talk to you about for the first while is sort of three converging trends that I think account for a lot of the otherwise inexplicable results we see in the daily papers about US politics, about their effects on the world, about trends in the journalism business that many of you will go into. And I'm going to selectively emphasize things I think might be different from what you already know. If I'm telling you things you already know, then there's no point in my telling you. But these are things that will be, I think, maybe complementary to what you're hearing in the Irish press and the US press as you look at it. So what I'm going to talk first is what has happened in the US in general that has led to this result of an unusual president. And I'm being sort of carefully clinical in saying we have an unusual character in office now. Unusual in that there has never before been in the presidency somebody with absolutely no public experience at all before. The vast majority of previous presidents have been governors or senators or military officers or judges. There's never before somebody with no public experience. I'll talk about how to understand the transformation of the U.S. that might have led to this result. Second, I'll talk about what is happening within the Republican Party in general. As you know, in U.S. parlance, the Republican Party is the conservative one, the one that Trump is now heading up and representing, and how to think about this moment in Republican Party politics. And then third, I'll talk about what's happening in the media that has led to this result and where it might all go. So this is, as promised, the combination of Trump, the United States, the media, how we got here and where it is all going to go. So I bet if I were to force any of you on a pop quiz to answer what's the main transformation in the US that led to Donald Trump, I won't do that because I'm a nice visiting guy. But I would imagine many of the answers would be, oh, the dislocations of the globalized economy and factories closing down and all of that has given us Trump. I think that is a partially true, but mainly misleading understanding of what's going on. I think there's something else that was happening, and that explanation leads you as much into peril as it does to insight. It certainly is the case, and everybody, so people in Ireland, even of your generation, you understand what economic dislocations can mean. Ireland has been through those in the last decade, as we all know. So has the UK, so has Europe, so has China, so has the United States. It's been a time of dislocation financially, starting 10 years ago, and in other ways, ongoing, generations-long process with factories and with coal mines and with everything else. Here's another pop quiz for you, which is going to be related to the larger point. When do you think the United States had the largest coal mining employment, knowing that Donald Trump ran to end the war on coal? Was it 10 years ago before Barack Obama? Was it 30 years ago, after Jimmy Carter? The peak U.S. employment in coal mining was before World War I. It's been a 100-year decline in coal mining. In the U.S., I imagine it's been the same in the UK too. There are certain industries that have been declining for a very long time. The U.S. now puts out more coal than it has practically at any time in its history, but it does it with 1/10 as many people as it did 100 years ago, just because of mechanization and things you're well familiar with here. And so my larger point is all the disruptions you've heard about in U.S. politics of immigration, of factories closing, of people thinking their houses, their communities are without a core. Those are true, but as everyone in Ireland would understand from Irish history, this is how it essentially has always been in the United States. That every decade of U.S. history you can find, some industry has been collapsing, people have been moving. The reason there are 10 times as many Irish Americans as there are Irish people is that people left Ireland in time of disruption in the 1800s, and they've moved all across the United States as industries have risen and fallen. And I'll give you an anecdotal illustration of this and then some larger ones. So I grew up, who here has been to Southern California? Probably some of you. You'll all be to Southern California eventually. I'm from a little town in Southern California called Redlands, whose main business was growing oranges. That was my main job when I was a kid. And the population there was 50-50 white and Latino. The whites, like me, had essentially all moved from Oklahoma, from Arkansas, from Kentucky, from Tennessee during the 1930s, during the Depression, because there was no work in the Dust Bowl in the foreign part of the United States, so they moved west. The Latinos had all moved from Mexico around 1910 because of the Mexican Revolution. And so you had in the experience of almost everybody in the United States, there's this idea of your own generation, your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation constantly being disrupted place by place. Over the last 150 years, if you look at the states of the U.S., of which there are 50, and the counties in those states, of which there are thousands taken together, in every 10-year census for more than 100 years, most counties in the U.S. have lost population. This is a dramatic point, I know, but so we see it underscored that most counties, that even as the U.S. population has more than doubled over the last century, most counties have lost population as people have moved, as cities on the West Coast have risen, in Texas and other places. So there is economic disruption now, but not as extreme as in most other parts of our history, and I can explain that later on if you'd like. Also, there is dislocation and resentment about immigration, but in a less acute way than has been the case in many other times in our national history. And so I will again use your own home country as an example of that. Something that is, I mentioned before that I've spent a long time in China and Japan and East Asia, and one of the conclusions I drew from there is the U.S. had a particular strength relative to both China and Japan, in which Ireland plays a crucial role, which is that the U.S. has been unique among large countries in being able to absorb large numbers of immigrants over the decades and to put them to constructive use. And the Irish arriving in the early and mid 1800s were a very important early illustration of that. That when the counterparts of your great-great-grandparents were going to Boston or New York or Chicago, it was often very disruptive when they arrived there. And there were riots between the German and British settlers who were there and the Irish immigrants. There were tensions about politics. When John F. Kennedy became president, it was kind of a validation of the Irish, precisely because there had been these tensions, the Irish and the Germans and the Chinese and the Italians and the Poles and the Slavs. And again, almost every decade of the U.S., with a few rare exceptions, you can see the immigrants of that moment being disruptive, but we look back on them as all part of the natural fabric of life. So that's happening again now in the U.S., but if you travel in sort of the interior of the country, as I've tried to do, most places it's been absorbed. And if you ask me questions about that, I'll give you illustrations from Kansas and South Dakota. Well, I'll give you an illustration from South Dakota. Who has heard of South Dakota? South Dakota is the home of Mount Rushmore. It's sort of as classically interior America as you could get. Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where the population is sort of evenly divided between German Lutherans and Norwegian Lutherans. It's a white place. It's become a major settlement area for refugees from Sudan, from Somalia, from Congo, from Cameroon, from Cambodia, from Burma, from Nepal, from all over the place. And the high school there is a very significant number of refugees there. And there have been even though it's a very conservative state, the state legislature, based partly on a report that my wife did, decided to change the rules of ROTC, which is the Young Officers Training Program, to allow young Muslim girls to wear Muslim scarves with their ROTC uniforms, just because this was part of making them part of the American fabric. My point is, if you were traveling inside the United States, you'd say the pageant of immigration is going on as it was in your forebears' time, and it's not much more disruptive than it's been in other eras. So if I'm arguing that the economy is troubled, but not in a crisis compared to most other eras in our history. And I think it's similar again to Ireland, where in the last decade there were big problems, but the trend has been positive for most people, not everybody. And if immigration is being absorbed in a way that is sort of consistent with historical trends, what is the issue that could lead to this sort of schism in national governance? The short version of my argument, which I can point you to Atlantic articles for the longer version, is that we have a historically dangerous divide between the way almost everything else in the country works and the way national politics works. That national politics has become almost uniquely dysfunctional, even at a time when the rest of the country, if you go there, if you're going on your J1 visa or whatever, you're having a trip to the US and you go to San Diego or Sioux Falls or whatever, you'll think things are going okay. And the split between national politics and the reality of the rest of the country is becoming a real issue. I'll give you only one other illustration of this that you can impress your American friends with when you go on the visits about why national politics is troublesome. You all know that we have a House of Representatives and a Senate in our Congress. House of Representatives, as you know, is more or less apportioned by population, although gerrymandering is an issue. The Senate is strictly by state. Every state, my home state of California, state of South Dakota, has 2 senators. When the compromise that led to the US Constitution was drafted in the 1780s, the range between the biggest state in terms of population and the smallest state in terms of population was 10 to 1. You know, the founders anticipated a 10 to 1 mismatch in power, and that seemed reasonable. Right now, the mismatch is 70 to 1. California has 70 times as many people as Wyoming does. And Alaska is not far ahead of Wyoming, and Delaware is in the same range. And so you have a real, what would be called in the British Isles a rotten borough problem of having a real sort of misrepresentation in the national government that has made it hard to do things. And without giving you all the rest of this argument that I could give you in some detail, say that the way to understand this issue in the political news you see, I contend, is not that the voice you're hearing out of the White House and his associates, not that this is the authentic channeled voice of the American public. It's the particular, this era's problem, this era's challenge of national governance, and it's kind of reached an extreme. So my point number one is, if you didn't know about national issues in the US, you would think it was a pretty good time for the country. That most places in Mississippi, in Nebraska, in Iowa, people feel like they're going in the right direction. So that's point one, and the longest point. Theme two, what's happened in the Republican Party that's led to this Republican president? Most of you, I believe, have heard of Richard Nixon. So actually, let's go back. I imagine most of you have heard of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the first person that our magazine endorsed. The magazine was founded in 1857 by British and American anti-slavery activists. It was called The Atlantic because we were working together across the Atlantic Ocean against slavery. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican Party president. And because of the Civil War in the US, where the Republicans were the Union group and the Democrats became de facto the Confederacy and the slave state group, for 80 plus years, almost a century after the Civil War, the Republican Party was seen as essentially the Northern Party, in many ways the Progressive Party, and many black Americans thought of themselves, when they could vote, as Republicans because that's who Lincoln had been, and the Southern Democrats, the South was the Democratic stronghold, and in a segregationist way. If we skip ahead to a Republican president of the 1960s, Richard Nixon, he introduced something whose name you should know, called the Southern Strategy. And the point of the Southern Strategy was to convert the white South from a Democratic stronghold to a Republican Party stronghold. This was after the Civil Rights Movement, after John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were signing civil rights bills to try to bring black Americans into more equality with the country. And so Richard Nixon, in a very calculated way, said, we can turn the whites of the South who resent the civil rights movement to our base. And so it was. And so if you look at a map now, essentially the old Confederate states a century and a half ago are now the Republican stronghold. And this has been, that was one of the trends that led to the Republican Party becoming more sort of the party of essentially white people and more prosperous people. The other person I'll mention to you in giving us where the Republican Party has ended up now is a man named William F. Buckley. He became prominent in the 1950s. He was, although his grandfather was a sheriff from South Texas, he made himself sound like an Oxford Union debater and was he pioneered the idea that conservatism could be intellectual. And so he said, we're going to, at just a time when the Republican Party and conservatism is moving towards this southern base, we're also going to have a conservative, an intellectual basis for it on free trade and on other sorts of things. We're not going to concede the intellectual terrain to the liberals and the Democrats. And for the 30 or 40 years since the convergence, the emergence of Richard Nixon and William F. Buckley, you've had some kind of tension and coexistence between those strains in the Republican Party. Sort of the nativist part of it becoming more and more a white person's party as the Democrats were becoming more educated people plus minorities of all kinds, blacks, whites, Asians, et cetera. There was a coexistence between those two in sort of a healthy tension. With the coming of Donald Trump, you see a really unstable balance because Trump is essentially the Southern strategy given human form. Somebody who is not afraid to inflame a lot of racial tensions, to use terms that in a US context are entirely understood to be racial put-downs for blacks and Latinos and Muslims and all the rest, and leading a party in his Congress that is not really like him, or they don't want to think they are like him. And they disagree on a lot of issues that the Republicans have stood for. They've claimed they're for reducing deficits, and they've claimed they're for free trade, and lots of things that Trump is not for. And so you see what I predict 10 or 15 years from now, when you all are book writers or professors or doing whatever you'll be doing 10 or 15 years from now, you'll look back on this moment and you'll say the Republican Party had reached really an unsustainable position. And we couldn't tell which trend was going to prevail. But the fact that Trump was standing for the part of the party's history they didn't like to talk about, that is, their sort of nativist impulse, while the party was still saying they were believed in free trade and other things. That was the instability. And in real time, we're seeing that. We don't know how it will turn out. Just say one other point here. The president I worked for when I was about your age, when I was in my early and mid-20s, Jimmy Carter, he sort of represented that same tension within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was in the sort of 40-year run after Franklin Roosevelt was having a lot of its own tensions, and that was part of the reason that Jimmy Carter was only one-term president. And I think we're seeing that now with the Republicans. But just to wrap this point up, I'm saying the country as a whole, point one, is in okay shape except for national politics, which are struggling. And point number two, the Republican Party, which now controls the White House and the House and the Senate and de facto the Supreme Court, is at its own sort of tension or strain point that can't go on forever. And so we'll see which side prevails, what gives. Now, theme three, how does the media play into this? And its ability to help the citizenry, the electorate, the governors understand the world they're working in. The book I'll hold up as a prop from 20 years ago called Breaking the News, How the Media Undermine American Democracy. It was written in what seems an innocent, almost Garden of Eden age now. This was 20 years ago when the Fox News channel was just getting going, when cable news was just getting some momentum. And in a very crucial way, there's an argument I make in this book which now seems hopelessly quaint. It's like arguing whether buggy whips or some other kind of whip are better to make your carriage go faster through the street. And the argument I was making then is that it was important for people in the news business, like many of you in the future, and people affected by the news business, like all of us, to recognize the difference between news and entertainment. That there was a reason why, through history, the reason why the U.S. has the First Amendment protecting the news business, because it's important for people to understand the world they live in. So I was saying that there are things that we recognize as having special status, not being purely market goods. Religion, education, the legal system, the health system, and the information system, I argued, they're all something different from just a grocery store or different from luxury housing or whatever. They have effects that are not purely market effects. And if you started basing news only on entertainment values, you're going to be in trouble. And the reason is entertainment is always more entertaining than the news. That's what it is for. It has no function other than to hold your interest. And if the news business is looking simply for what will hold your interest this second, then that's going to mean that just every sort of distortion in how you understand what's good, what's bad, and a million other things. I'll give you just one illustration of this, of the thousands I have in the book. So before you were born, probably when some of your parents were young, in the 1970s, in the United States, big city crime was a real problem. In New York, in Chicago, in DC, where I was living then, it was really a crime-ridden era. And we had a lot of tough guy mayors who came. Rudy Giuliani in New York is probably the best known of them. They cracked down on crime, And from the 1970s till now, crime in the US has gone way, way down, overall in the big cities in particular. Interestingly, from the 1970s till now, fear of crime has gone up and up and up. At just the time the actual thing has gone down, the fear of it has gone up. And an important reason for that is that local news shows and cable news have found that people will watch a mugging, a rape, a carjacking. They'll watch that even if it happens 1,000 miles away, because that's, people somehow will just stay on that rather than some report on the health system or on the education system. And so the entertainment basis of the news has made people more fearful than they need to be, and there are 1,000 analogies of that. This is for those, how many of you are imagining you'll have your career in the news in some form? So it's a great way to spend your careers. I hope you all should do it. It's the most interesting thing you can possibly do. It's never been a secure line of work, but that's part of its charm. So seriously, it's like people who go into the journalism business, it's like people who feel they have to go into acting or sports or politics or music. It's something you do because you have to, and it's, if it were more, because so many people would like to do this, they don't have to have this stable career conditions of being a civil servant. It is life on the edge, but it's a worthwhile edge, and I'll tell you more about that. But my point is that this is not the first time that the media have gone through economic shocks of the kind that they're going through now. If you look again in the 1920s, there were all sorts of changes to big city newspapers across the Western world, and since the era of mass information, maybe in the 1700s, every 2 or 3 decades, there's some big extinction event that changes the pre-existing business models and makes people scramble for new business models, new fortunes rise and fall, people adjust what they're doing. So that's, although it's a particularly harsh pressure right now, that's not unusual, nor is this the first time that we've seen government, in particular in the United States, putting pressure on the news media. Very early in the US history, there was something called the Alien and Sedition Acts under President John Adams, the second president. This was a kind of early censorship that was being imposed in the United States. Even the sainted Abraham Lincoln had some press controls during the Civil War. The time of World War I, Woodrow Wilson, a great progressive, had a lot of controls on the news. Richard Nixon had his attacks on the press. This is an ongoing tension because political leaders don't like a free press. So that is part of how it's been too. The challenge, I think, for all of you in your role as shaping our future as news consumers and news producers is that these endless battles over the financing of the news business and the political function of the news, they're taking a different form now, which means a different kind of resistance, a different kind of adaptation from all of you. There's one other sort of historical constant I should mention. We all know about the siloization and information bubbles that happen now via social media in particular. It takes a new form now, but I'm not sure it's entirely unprecedented. In my childhood, there were just a few big television networks, so everybody sort of had the same information sources as you do from your state media here. But I've interviewed American historians who say that back in the 1800s, most people were illiterate then. There was a significant minority view in the US who thought that Abraham Lincoln was actually a primate rather than a human being because he sort of looked like a gorilla, and there were publications making this point. And the whole sort of concept of slavery and the science of slavery had a strong hold on about 40% of the country. So that too exists before. But the challenge for all of you, and this will sort of lead me to the conclusion, is the economic challenge to the business of public information is acute and different from before, although we've had the challenges. The state challenge is in a different form with a different personality, but we've had that before. And the siloization is also taking a different technologically based form. So the challenge for all of you and your time as reporters and producers and citizens and teachers and parents is to figure out as each preceding generation has. What's the solution to the business model now? What's the solution to the government relations? And what's the solution to the info bubble? And I think that those responses are beginning to take form. In the US, most serious publications are financially doing much better at this moment than they were 15 months ago, because there's new attention on the kinds of things that we provide. I know that most technology companies, with one big exception that I'll reveal if you ask me, most technology companies are thinking, what can they do to improve this situation? Across the country, state attorneys general and state legislators are saying how we can protect our news sources. So the response is beginning, but it depends on all of you. To wrap this up, I'm really glad to have a chance to see you all here at DCU and to have my few minutes of trying to mold the future of info leaders and influencers across your country and Europe and the Anglophone world, or even beyond the Anglophone world. And to say that you should recognize, number one, what's happening in the United States is a particular problem of national governance as opposed to national rot. You know, it's a national governance issue as opposed to the whole country having gone mad. Second, that there is the Republican Party. You're watching it at a time of historic tension, and 10 years from now you'll know how this turns out. And third, your generation of communicators and journalists has your version of the challenges that all of your predecessors have faced, so it is up to you to deal with them. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions or complaints on any of these points, and so thank you for paying attention. And so so I will turn over, to local authority will rule in choosing questioners. How about that?
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Matthew. I'm from the MAJ program.
Yes.
I had a question about the place of technology and technology companies, and specifically Mark Zuckerberg into the frame of the Democratic Party, because
Yes.
for some is seen as the only people who can get out of the slump that the Democratic Party is in right now.
So the question is about Mark Zuckerberg, founder and CEO of Facebook, and whether he will be involved. You know, there's sort of a rumor campaign that he will run for president. This is not exactly the question you're asking me, but I will come to the question you're asking me. To my mind, the technology company that deserves most blame right now is Facebook. I think Facebook, all of you, I'm sure all of you are on Facebook, all of you should be putting pressure on Facebook because they are behaving in an irresponsible and value-free way that is different from, let me think about how to put this carefully. I would like Facebook to pay more attention to what Twitter, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, through the form of Jeff Bezos, who now owns the Washington Post. I think those other technology companies are thinking more deliberately and carefully about the social and political impact of what they do than Facebook is. Facebook is probably the most influential of them and the least thoughtful about it.
Twitter is really doing a really bad job until now, and on most accounts.
So I think that Facebook, so let's use a historical analogy. So 150 years ago, in an age of mechanization and coal and all the other things, that, war machines were being invented 150 years ago, there were some of the great technologists of that era who became socially responsible one way or another, some who were not. I think that Facebook is a very distinct laggard in that field, and so that they should be thinking more carefully about the effects on Western democracy and on attention spans, on everything else. So in a constructive way, I'll say that I hope that Mark Zuckerberg, rather than running for office, will channel those energies internally in his company to have the company, let's say have the company run for office, have the company run for champion of the small d democratic world. So how about that?
Hi James, I'm Tony Considine, also from the MHA programme. I was very interested in the point you made just about the sort of battle in the Republican Party at the moment and saying that the Democrats went through similar in the Carter era. Do you think that the Democrats are also going through sort of something similar now with, on the one side, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren sort of wing, well, that grassroots movement that felt utterly disenfranchised by the Hillary Clinton candidacy, and the sort of older guard, including the Clintons, that still seem to be determined to hang on, that there's a real battle there as well.
So the question is whether the split among the Democrats is comparable to the one among the Republicans, and I think not. I mean, I think that Will Rogers, the famous humorist of the 1930s, used to say, "I'm a member of no organized party, I'm a Democrat." And so I think this has been, the Democratic Party at almost every stage in its history has had tensions worse than this. I mean, it is a source of tension, but if you look at almost any point of substance, it's a difference around a more or less agreed upon point. There's some kind of difference, some kind of improvement in government supported health care, for example. Everybody is for, it's just a matter of degree. Some kind of a more progressive tax structure people are for. There's differences on trade pacts, et cetera, but I think it's certainly within the historic band of Democratic Party tension. You could contrast it with when I was working for Jimmy Carter. Teddy Kennedy actually ran against him for the nomination in a way that very badly damaged Carter's prospects for re-election. When Harry Truman was president in the early 1950s, the southern wing of the party sort of broke off in the Dixiecrats. And so there have been in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson, there was a huge fight. So there are tensions within the Democratic Party, but they're of historic scale. I think the tension in the Republican Party are much more fundamental. And just to illustrate this a little more, we've seen, of course, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, and a number of others. Once they decide they're not going to run again, they unload on Donald Trump and what he's doing. I can tell you firsthand that many other Republican senators think the same thing, and they just are fearful of saying it. There's nothing comparable among the Democrats now. That the Bernie people don't like Hillary and vice versa, but it's within a band.
Even in light of the DNC leaks and...
There's, so this is the John Podesta leaks. I mean, if you had the email from any presidential campaign through history, you would find things like that. So that would be my view.
I'm Ross, also from the MHA class. You're probably going to be sick of hearing from us.
So I didn't hear the last thing you said.
I'm from the MHA
Yeah.
class as well. So obviously we all know Trump's not a massive fan of the mainstream media. My question is, given the rise of, I suppose, kind of internet bloggers and I don't want to say casual, but more not mainstream news sources that don't really feel themselves held accountable to upholding unbiased reporting and facts, how is the main media going to combat that when, like, obviously these like Breitbart and all these kind of very right-wing bloggers, they don't really care about the facts because they know that the people they're aiming themselves at will read it, just have their own biases confirmed. So how does the media
Yes,
combat that?
this is a genuine issue, and I would not mean at all to minimize the seriousness of a substantial minority of the United States believing things and being encased in a media world that tells them things that just aren't true. That you all probably know 1,000, but probably there's some recent polls saying that still most Republicans think that Barack Obama was born in Kenya or wherever, but not born in the United States. And even Trump, in kind of a hostage video, finally said no, Obama was born in the United States. So that is a real problem. It's important to note that it is a problem, and also that it is a minority of people. It is the famous base for Trump. Let's say it's 35% of people. That's a significant number. main answer the rest of the media seems to have is to simply try to do the best possible job of presenting a recognizable version of reality and hoping over time that this will accrete. And I think an illustration of that is in the last 2 weeks, the non-political news in the U.S. has been dominated by sexual aggression scandals, starting with Harvey Weinstein of Miramax Pictures, now cascading just to all sorts of people. And there's been, even though Trump, when these allegations were made about him during the campaign, said, oh no, this is all fake. Essentially, these accounts have all been assumed to be true by everybody, and just even people on the political right, if they're not about Trump, they assume these accounts are true. And so I think there is still, the main thing the media can do is sort of keep laying down the bricks of here is our best version of reality, not going crazy, not being hysterical, but just saying we're trying to tell you what we think the reality is, and we hope over time this will be a wall that we can build in a constructive way.
Hi, I'm Payu. I'm also from the MA class. So after elections, I read a lot of coverage in which a lot of publications blamed other publications for extensive coverage of Trump as a reason as to why he was elected. Like every minute thing he did, it was covered. But the very fact that you don't cover Trump doesn't make him go away. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there was my 15-second version of what happened in the election, which I'll come back to your question, is that 10,000 things had to all coincidentally go in one direction to have the result that we came up with. And I've mentioned some other people here in the last day or two. I know firsthand that even by the nighttime of election day, the people around Trump, they were all sure he was going to lose. Everybody thought he was going to lose. Even he himself, he was not prepared to, either in the short term or the long term. So it required a whole bunch of the things, and among two of those were, first you had a person who everybody in the U.S. knew, and they knew him from a particular TV role of being the boss, sitting at this giant desk and telling people you're fired, so he had like a 20-year imprint as being in exactly this role, and so he was sort of pre-qualified in that way. On the other side, Hillary Clinton had been both known and sort of vilified for a long time, and I think because the mainstream media assumed she was going to win, they held her in a way to a higher standard. And so I contend that her email problems, while careless, were objectively sort of a third-tier issue. But they were portrayed every day in the press as if they were of equal importance. And here's everything Trump has done, and here's Hillary's email. And I think that was because they assumed she was going to win. And so they were having this sort of incumbent level vetting going on. So I think those were two of the things. And Trump, cable TV, more people would watch if you had Trump on because he is an entertainer and he's entertaining.
Yeah, we're getting time for about two more.
Hi, I'm Laura from the MHA course as well. Just what were you kind of talking about national politics and stuff like that. As a sort of possible solution and in terms of what the media could kind of do to, I mean, America has sort of relied on almost a two-party system for centuries now, but should the media not be also almost promoting that we get away from that? Because as an outsider looking in, I mean, this was the first kind of American presidential election I was able to follow, because when Obama got in, I was quite young. And to me it was kind of strange watching how it was always kind of the Democrats and the Republicans, and it almost felt like a reality show, people getting eliminated each round after each debate. That's what it was kind of like, and it was just strange for me to watch that, because we always just have so many different parties and we kind of pick our favourite candidates from each one. So do you think that the media should be sort of focusing that Americans broaden their horizons? Because I've also seen arguments that people were felt like voters of third parties were also to blame for Trump getting elected.
And I think to answer the last part first, I think, again, among the reason that both Jill Stein and Gary Johnson got as much of a vote as they did is, again, everybody assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win. So if you weren't enthusiastic about her, you might as well say, I want to support a third party because it doesn't matter. She's going to win, so I can vote for one of these other people. I think that just to give a concise version here, the United States only a country with as much going for it as the U.S. has could survive the political system the U.S. does. The U.S. political system, in my view, is structurally gravely flawed. And it's no coincidence that no other country except the Philippines has actually copied it. And parliamentary systems would make more sense, but that can't be. You know, just the rules are what they're going to be, the Senate is how it's going to be. And for reasons I can tell you later on, it's extremely difficult to break the two-party lineup. It's no accident that the last president from a third party was Abraham Lincoln. He was sort of the last successful third-party president. There have been very serious candidates in the century and a half since then, but none of them has broken like the 15% threshold. It's a really, really difficult thing to change. So I think realistically, the action is within the two parties as opposed to a third party.
Okay, last question. Please.
From a journalist point of view, do you think the uncertainty around the Trump presidency is more of a localized issue to the US and it's been exaggerated across the Atlantic? Or do you think no, actually you need to worry about it? And if so, what do you think would be the biggest rippling effect for Greater Europe?
So I've lived about 15 years outside the United States, mainly in Asia, but here in Europe too. And non-Americans always point out it's unfair that the world doesn't have a vote in the U.S. presidential election, although Russia might, because the implications are so great given U.S. world power. And so I think the effects are mainly on and in the United States, but an American president has enormous things at his or her personal discretion. The North Korean situation is going to affect everybody. And the Paris Climate Accords will affect everybody. Although the fact that all U.S. mayors immediately stepped up to say we're still in has an effect. So I think it's a drama that is principally of American consequence, but nobody can ignore it because the world is too much influenced by the U.S. to have it be a purely local affair.
Okay, I'm sorry, but there's a lot of people out there who want to be in here, which means we have to go. So thank you.